Awesome. Hello, guys. Welcome to yet another talk of Sarakulata Architecture Talk Tank. Today, I have an incredible guest, Celeste Bolte from Australia, who now lives in London, and she works for a company called Bowerbird. I'll let you, Celeste explain a little bit more about her role and what she's all about, but very excited for this talk today because we're going to be talking about some of the very important things in communications and marketing strategies for architects, and why is it important to actually get published. So hi Celeste, thank you so much for joining me today on that
Hi,
talk.
Sarah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to be chatting with you, especially in these funny times. Yeah, that was a really nice intro. I do work for Bowerbird, so I'm a comms specialist. I've worked in architecture and design for the last maybe 5 or 6 years, and sort of more broadly across design and technology and fashion for about the last 8 years. So my background is marketing and comms. I worked for big practice. I worked as a strategist in agencies, and now I run Bowerbird here in the UK.
Amazing. So tell us a little bit more about Bowerbird.
Sure. So Bowerbird is a platform that architects and journalists use. And, the platform was set up maybe 6 years ago now by an architect and a design journalist who wanted to see a much easier way for architects to publish their work and to get in touch with journalists, but also for publications to find more great architecture. I think traditionally architecture publishing has been restricted to either those with the budgets to hire, in-house people like myself to run press, or those who can afford studios and agencies. But really, all scales of practice should have access to architectural press. So we've designed a platform that allows studios of any size to reach journalists. And I guess on the other side of that too, it's really important for publications to find architecture because it has such an impact on our daily lives. And architecture shouldn't just be published in, trade press or design publications. It needs to be shared far more broadly. So we're making that access a lot easier for other publications.
That's excellent, really. And indeed, now with the times of social media, it's so important to kind of be seen also in these online platforms. And one of the things that I love how you guys speak about your work is that architects don't advertise, they get published. So it's indeed very important to put your design and your existence and your presence and what you're doing out there so people can find out about you, read. And so that's what you guys are doing. This is excellent. And you come from a background in communications. Why communications is so important for architects?
Oh, a multitude of reasons. When you share your practice story or your projects, you're not just bringing new people into your own sort of audience. You're actually sharing the value of architecture and building a profession up as you go. So architecture, it's such a part of our daily lives, and I think historically it hasn't been communicated as well as it could have. There are a couple of factors that come down to that, institutional clauses, that prohibited architects from advertising their services, and these kinds of clauses kind of set up a bit of a, you might say, sort of sticky relationship between architecture and communications. So I think a lot of practices sort of confuse communications with advertising, whereas they're quite different. Communications is so important to architecture because, it doesn't only bring new people into your practice and get you new clients. It also allows you to build your employer brand and also reach out and connect to your peers and share ideas. So it's extremely vital to practices, and it allows studios to connect with the kinds of clients they want to work with and also the kinds of staff they want to bring into the practice.
Sure. And I'm also imagining that, storytelling right now is such a buzzword. So many businesses talk about it. And I know that you also carry a message about storytelling in your performances and on stages and when you talk about this as an expert. Can you elaborate a little bit on what storytelling is according to you and why is it important? And also what other elements communications really consist of?
Ooh, what elements communications consists of is a big question, so I'll come back to that one next. But storytelling for architects really is about talking about the project, not just as a built project, but as a process, and also who the clients were for that. So I think within architectural education, students are always taught to justify their design choices, and a lot of that comes down to technical language. Now, that often isn't appropriate for, I guess, non-design literate audiences. So that can sort of, hinder architects from communicating really well with potential clients or external audiences. Storytelling really comes down to the human element, or the essence of that project. A lot of residential practices make the mistakes of talking about the fenestration or the window detailing, but really the potential client is going to connect with the family that sits on that window seat and watches their kids play in the garden. It's much more about bringing that sort of personal and maybe sort of experiential element to your communications and your project description. Elements of communication, I think that's a big question. It comes down to this idea of the marketing mix. So we often talk about the marketing mix as being made up of different activities that you do in conjunction with each other to get you the most exposure in your, target audience. So I guess some of those pillars might be entering awards. It might be social media. One of those is definitely publishing. That should be your baseline. And I guess on top of that, in the non-COVID era, it might be events, or now it might be webinars and sort of digital meetups. So there's lots of different things that studios can do, and all of the little strings that you pull on in your marketing mix can kind of talk to each other. For example, if you're getting your project published in Wallpaper and Design, you're going to want to share that on your social media to, sort of reach their audiences as well as build up your own. So there's lots of different ways that studios can sort of maximize on communications, but it's always really important to come back to this idea of like the central message. So I think a lot of studios sort of make the mistake of maybe not defining what it is they want to say. And that can be a really hard thing to define. And so we see that a lot of clients or a lot of practices should always maybe speak to an external party about creating either a manifesto or an ethos document that just underpins how your practice communicates with the world. If you're a sustainable practice in Devon or a very large commercial firm in Liverpool, the way that you communicate and the messages that you share are going to be very different. So you need to sort of define that that thing that you want to say, or the real sort of key to your practice very early on, because it will inform what you publish, where you publish it, how you speak about your practice, and the kinds of clients that you bring in through those messages.
For sure. I think it's really important. It almost is like the ABC of business, but architects unfortunately don't always get a good introduction to business. So sometimes it comes to a point where practices have to define their why and their main message, and also really define their target audience like later on in their existence. And again, those things are kind of buzzwords, but in the same time, it's so important that your message lands really at the right audience, because once we know exactly who's the best buyer for our product, we can also speak to them directly, communicating their pain points and communicating the solutions that we can solve and help them with. So in respect of understanding all of this, let's just say if a practice hasn't done any of this work, where would you recommend for them to start?
I think going back to sort of the drawing board and going, what kind of work do they want to do? I always say, tell the stories of the work you want more of. It gets you sort of into either talking about a really great client relationship, or, you got to work on a really interesting public project. Speak about those experiences, because when they're shared with external audiences, you start to connect with people who have, a shared commonality in that story, or who might see themselves as, that client, or who want to visit that kind of public project or commission a public project like that. So always go back to the drawing board and just set out, who that, what those kinds of projects are, who you would like to work with, who is your dream client, not just someone with a whole bunch of cash. Talk about like what their personality is like, and maybe the kinds of work that they'd like you to do as well. And then consider, what your year ahead is going to look like. I think it's really important for studios to know when their projects are finishing and what visual aids are going to come with those. So do you have time to get photography? Can you style that project? What's the window going to be? Just plan ahead when you know that there's some solid dates, because content is really important. So studios often come to Bowerbird with photography that maybe isn't professionally shot, or isn't quite, maybe isn't shot by an architectural photographer. And that is really, really important. Having the right photography of your project, it carries you so far. You might not have a project finishing for another 2 years. That's going to get you through that 2 years. That's your content for that time. So consider content from the start as well. I guess on top of that, consider what channels you really want to share on. Do you want to be managing an Instagram account every week? Can you be bothered? I know a lot of practices can't. So maybe just focus on the areas that you feel you're happy to sort of share your stories, and just be sure to make sure that you're putting the right effort in, because I think a poorly managed profile, account, dashboard or platform, it looks really terrible. So making sure that whatever you do, whatever your efforts are, just keep them consistent and keep them manageable for you as that practice.
Once people start doing it, what direct benefits can they expect to get from these actions?
I think there are a couple of different benefits from good communications. One of them, particularly from press, is validation. So architecture absolutely is a word of mouth industry, but we have to recognize that word of mouth has really changed in the last even 10, 20 years. We Google everything. If someone tells me about a restaurant they've been to, I'm going to look it up and see what their reviews are like. We always seek, sort of a secondary recommendation for something we're interested in pursuing. So architecture is no different. All of the times that you're published, your Instagram account, all of the ways that you communicate, they validate you as a practice to your potential clients. So this is really important to focus on. I think the other sort of benefits for practices from good communications is having clarity. So, your potential clients are going to know how you work. They're going to know the kind of expectations that you have, the quality of projects that you do. It's really important to note that they're also going to sort of know who you are as a practice and know what that working relationship might be. So there's a couple of real benefits there.
One of the things that you speak about a lot is your passion for building community. And I know that in your line of work, it's very important, and I can see how it definitely profits and benefits the business side of things too. But why would building community be important also for architects, and in which ways could that benefit them? Because it's such an interesting aspect. It kind of almost goes beyond just following on Instagram. It's almost like being united with the same interests and perhaps staying in touch a little bit more, knowing about each other a little more. There is surely many different ways in which you can define community, but I can imagine it being something a little bit more interactive. So how can architects build this kind of relationship, and why would they? And also, how could that benefit their businesses? Because that's one of the things that when we look into the future, it's one of the things that definitely is an important step to consider when going into digital world and perhaps building a presence online as an architecture firm or as an individual. So I think it's really interesting to consider that and look into benefits and actually understand that it's something perhaps not practiced so much in the traditional sense of architecture, but it could be the future.
I think community is a really interesting part of architecture, because I think that architects are really tight. They're friends with each other. The practices are quite collegiate, despite there obviously being competition in some circles. I think architects are a really friendly profession with between peers. So I think, something that we're seeing a lot at the moment is obviously during COVID-19 era, practices are banding together and they're creating strength in numbers. There's a collective here in London called the Dalston Architecture Collective. Now, this collective has stemmed from a group who co-work together. They're all down at the Bootstrap charity at Dalston Junction in East London. And they've gotten together to create, sort of standards of consultations and opportunities to reach new clients. So they are offering free consultations for potential residential practices. And I think that allows them to reach all of their audiences together. So it's a lot more power in numbers. Something that also is really important about community is job sharing, and collaboration. A lot of practices sort of sneeze at the idea of getting published in the trade press, but really that's quite a valuable place, because if you're a practice who's slightly larger than you sees that you're doing this kind of work and they maybe can't take a job on, they might refer you as a different architect for that project to that potential client. So there are a lot of benefits from community. But I think as well, it comes down to just having people you can rely on. Architecture can be quite a solo industry. If you're a sole practitioner, it can be really tricky to know how to negotiate insurance and contracts, and there's lots of intricacies in running a practice, especially as a small studio. So building community gives you, your support network, and kind of allows you to know that you're not in it alone, I think, as well.
It's so important, and being able to kind of like find support in one another with any industry, really. So, I speak to a lot of experts these days within architecture, and everybody has kind of a bit of a different understanding of the situation right now with COVID-19. I wonder what is your impression right now in terms of the problems perhaps that the industry is facing, and some individual cases that maybe you've heard about that have, they kind of almost raise an issue that perhaps might be a bit more global, and, what is happening right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been coming to me and asking what the opportunities are to market themselves in this time, but also coming to me with the concern that they don't want to be salesy. And I completely agree. It's so important to make sure that you're posting, being active online, sharing your projects, getting published, but maybe not, going for the buy one consultation, get one free type of vibe. And I think as well, sort of this question still stems from the misunderstanding between advertising and communication. Communication is sharing what you do. Advertising is, paying for space to bring clients in. So these are really different things. They're not interchangeable. I think I'm hearing a lot of studios just wondering what the options are. I mean, when you're running a practice, everything else will chase you. Clients will chase you, contractors will chase you, your team will chase you, but marketing doesn't. And communications just doesn't. Like, journalists are far too time poor than to chase you up for images from a request they put in a week ago. So if you miss those opportunities, they're usually gone. But now, considering we're not having those sort of distractions of day-to-day office life, or it might be a different kind of distraction if you're at home with young kids, but there are fewer distractions, so it's allowing practices to kind of step back and maybe have a look at their business plans, maybe have a look at their press plans, and just start to see that there are lots of opportunities and lots of different tools that studios can use to make these functions work better for them. Because, as we sort of talked about before, comms really is, or communication, sorry, really is vital to architecture, but it's often the thing that kind of goes unchecked. But now we have time to sort of go back and plan as to what might be good for the practice in terms of communicating. What are we saying? Are we saying it to the right people? Are we getting the right kinds of inquiries in? Why? Having some time to analyze. I think a lot of studios are enjoying the time to write their own content. I mean, intelligent content is so important, owned channels, so the channels that you publish yourself, so your social media, your website. These are really big opportunities to share thought leadership articles, even to begin pitching that kind of content into trade press. So in London, that's the AJ, Architecture Today, Design. A lot of studios are starting to think about what might the future of the sector that they work in look like after COVID, and how can they start to think and talk about those ideas and generate conversation online around those.
Like, I think a lot of architects, whether having practice or just working for themselves or still in education, are very much used to the fact that we're problem solvers. And right now there is a clear problem. And I think that, it's the first wave of everything that happened has come a bit of as a shock. And a lot of people were probably focusing on, oh my God, what am I going to do with my practice? What if the projects pull out? But also, there's probably for a week now more and more practices coming up with solutions, and I really love reading the different perspectives that have been put out there. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you so much. If anyone was interested in perhaps using that opportunity now of being at home and doing digital marketing or focusing on publishing, on communications, where should they go?
I think a really good a good way to sort of look at comms is to either look at the tools available to you. I mean, obviously Bowerbird is one of those, so we're online at bowerbird.io. But even just going back and having a listen to our podcast, we recorded a podcast. We have 2 series, and it's how to get your architecture published. Now, this goes into detail on everything from how to title your architecture project, what to say when you reach out to journalists, how to create journalist lists, the importance of photography, how to brief a photographer. Lots of short little episodes that are really good resources. So I think, take the time now to listen and learn, and then come to us when you've got a bit of an action plan.
Amazing. So the podcast is available on your website and on iTunes, I'm imagining.
Yeah,
and there is more information on the website as well. And do you want to explain a little bit how Bowerbird works if you're an architect that wants to join?
Oh, yeah, sure. So it works in the architects register with us. We have a look at your projects and see how we can match you up to journalists, and then we catch up and I'll take you through the platform. Or you'll meet one of my colleagues from different areas around the world. There are 8 of us working remotely. So we have a really great team, and I think we're kind of lucky, being a remote team, we can kind of weather this storm already. So practices pop their projects up and you can send them to any of the journalists on our database. So it's a much more efficient way to reach press and to manage, that sort of press process without having to spend too much time on, maintaining databases and your own contact lists, which I know can be really tricky.
And contacting press as well, I can imagine that would normally be a lot of work. So
yeah, marketing and press is a full-time job. I think a lot of studios underestimate that, and sort of think that, once you send something out, every journalist is going to pick that up, but not necessarily. It's about, finding the right publication at the right time for your project. So there are definitely a lot more opportunities than we realize, but there's also a lot more work that goes into it for a marketing manager in a practice. Not to say, though, that any studio can't do it. It's just about having the right information for your projects.
Excellent. All right. Well, bowerbird.io it is. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise and giving some advice. It was lovely talking to you today. Wishing you all the best. And bye, guys. Thank you for listening as well.